Ad Infinitum is yet another indie horror game of 2023 that also attempts to compete with the likes of the Amnesia series. You, the player, portray a German soldier in the middle of World War I. The entire game focuses on traveling back and forth between nightmare and reality as this soldier comes face to face with his childhood home and the horrors of a trench in the middle of a war. The story plays with the idea that both areas are experiencing reality, past, and fiction all at the same time, and you as a player have to unravel the mystery and figure out exactly what the hell is going on here.
Finally. Is that you, soldier? Was that you by the plane? My eyes. I can't see a thing. But they cannot deceive me anymore.
So coming into this game, despite it having a pretty interesting concept, my expectations were kind of low. I wasn't trying to overhype myself for this game because a lot of these first-person indie horror games that try to follow in the footsteps of Amnesia usually miss the mark completely. The most recent example that I can think of would be Unholy. So with that in mind, I tried to temper my expectations, knowing these games usually don't play out that well. With that being said, I was pleasantly surprised with the game overall. I mean, don't get me wrong, the gameplay was horrendous and the storytelling was nowhere near on par with most of the Amnesia games. But with that being said, I still fairly enjoyed the game as a whole. So as always, let's start with the gameplay. As I mentioned earlier, this was probably one of the weaker parts of the game. To be fair, even most of the Amnesia games struggle when it comes to gameplay. But even with that in mind, this game still lacked a competent gameplay experience. Primarily, this game is a stealth game first, puzzle solving game second, followed by some traces of exploration while also feeling very linear. Notice how I didn't touch on the horror side of things? Yeah, that's because outside of a few areas in the game, it didn't really feel like a scary game. It felt more like a psychological thriller with a dash of horror. Anyway, looking at the gameplay, a majority of the time you'll be spent exploring to find dog tags and other useful items or hiding away from vicious monsters in the bunker. Unfortunately, with the exception of the hospital section, none of the monsters really felt that intimidating. Most of them usually chase after you, and if they do manage to catch up to you, it's as easy as mashing a button to get away from them. Of course, I wasn't really expecting much in terms of the gameplay at all when it came to this game, but I still expected a little bit more than what we got. As far as other gameplay mechanics, one of the biggest things you'll find yourself doing in this game is solving some really interesting puzzles. Some at first are extremely easy to solve and yeah, kind of boring. Hell, I would say the first half of the entire game feels like this, as the game is definitely a slow burn at the beginning. However, as you continue throughout the game, you'll find some more creative puzzles that involve you as the player to think outside of the box. For example, the boss fights. Unlike most games, Ad Infinitum requires the players to face off against the bosses by solving puzzles. Now, the puzzles are pretty straightforward and easy to solve. However, when you throw in the anxiety and fear of dealing with an unstoppable monster, it does add a level of difficulty to it. Another cool aspect about the boss fights is that each one adds an element of choice to it that'll change the ending of the game. Now, I don't want to talk too much about it because I've played the game only once and I haven't fully explored this game with other endings yet, but I can say that I didn't get the good ending because of the choices I personally made in these fights. I don't know how effective each choice is, but I do believe there are at least 3 endings depending on what you decide during these encounters. Again, not fully sure about the details, but just know that there are consequences to your actions throughout the game, especially during the boss fights. Outside of what I just covered, the only other impactful gameplay mechanic is the exploration. However, don't expect levels of Amnesia the Bunker. For the most part, usually only the mansion segments allow exploration, and even then, it's a small section of exploring the same exact mansion over and over again as you get farther into the game, but just with new doors unlocked. The trenches allow some exploration as well, but primarily it's just to go down short roads to find dog tags, and then you turn around and continue down the linear path. Other than those two parts of the game, the exploration is pretty minimal. There are some things that this game does though that feels exactly like the Amnesia games, like how the documents are vital to learning about the story as a whole, or how the player uses the same light source used in Amnesia The Bunker, or even down to having multiple endings with a very impactful story. It's clear to see that this game took a lot of inspiration from the Amnesia games and put their own spin on the genre. Now let's look at the other important part of any video game, the story. When it comes to the story and the characters, I feel like this is where the game really shines. The acting is top notch. The details of this mystery surrounding the game is captivating and really pulls the player into the experience. And the main character, who constantly battles between what is reality and what is nightmare, while also deciding what is right and what is wrong, is just an amazing story overall to follow. Actually, I would argue that this is the one thing that this game might have done better than Amnesia The Bunker, in my opinion. A few complaints that I had about The Bunker was that the story was predictable, the alternate endings really didn't change that much from each other, and the story wasn't as interesting as other entries of the series. However, Ad Infinitum definitely tops The Bunker in these areas. The two endings that I've personally seen are completely different from each other. The story and the mystery of the game is much better and far less predictable in my opinion, and I found myself wanting to push through this game as fast as possible so that I can find out for myself as to what the hell is going on here. Unfortunately though, that's about the only thing that exceeds expectations. Everything else about the game was either a disappointment or on par with what I expected from the game. Still, when you compare it to some of the biggest disappointments in horror this year, like For Solace or Unholy, it's a massive improvement. The story is much more interesting. It at least tries to stand out with its gameplay, and it even comes up with some really interesting puzzles and unique ways of battling against bosses of the game. The story is much more interesting. It at least tries to stand out with its gameplay, and it even comes up with interesting puzzles and unique ways of battling against the bosses of the game. Still, the biggest disappointment in my opinion comes from the lack of horror. This was one of the biggest marketing aspects of the game, and it definitely let me down here. Anyway, let's just wrap this review up and get to the final verdict. Overall, I think this is a decent game. When I'm trying to find games to compare it to in order to help me figure out a good score for this, the easy answer that I come up with is, of course, the Amnesia games. Specifically The Bunker, since it's the most recent entry and it even takes place during World War I as well. Hell, they even share a lot of similar mechanics. And while The Bunker is a far superior game and it definitely beats Ad Infinitum on almost every level, I don't think Ad Infinitum is a massive step down from The Bunker. I feel like overall this is an average game in this genre. Therefore, I gotta give it a 5 out of 10. The biggest reason ultimately comes down to the gameplay. The story is interesting enough, but with the gameplay not as competent as others in the same genre, like the Amnesia games, it didn't feel right to give it an above average score. With that said, I think it's a decent game and a fun experience. And I definitely think it's multiple steps above games like For Solace or Unholy. So I find myself right there in the middle. But that's it for this review, guys. Hit up the comments and let me know if you played this game already, and if so, what do you think of my score? Do you agree? And if not, what score would you give this game? Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more reviews just like this one. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.